being, you know...
Well, what about Frankie Goes to Hollywood, then?
I think it's garbage.
Huh?
Total garbage. On stage, the worst act I've seen.
Oh, you went to see them in America?
Yeah, I went to see them at the Ritz. They were just terrible. And they know it.
Mick Jagger, the lead singer of the Rolling Stones, is one of rock music's most iconic and influential figures. He became controversial for his rebellious persona, provocative stage performances, and open defiance of social norms during the 60s and 70s. Mick Jagger has never been shy about sharing his musical opinions. Now, at 82, he has revealed the names of 8 musicians he openly dislikes, along with the stories behind those long-standing feuds. At number 8, we have John Lennon. John Lennon was a revolutionary English singer, songwriter, and musician best known as a co-founder of the Beatles. His legendary songwriting partnership with Paul McCartney created some of the most influential music in history. The rivalry between the Rolling Stones and the Beatles was one of the biggest in music history, and at the center of it were the sharp words exchanged between Mick Jagger and John Lennon. In the 1960s, you were either a Beatles fan or a Stones fan. The Beatles were seen as the clean-cut melodic pop group, while the Stones were the rebellious bad boys of rock. The media absolutely loved the rivalry and played it up at every chance. At first, the two bands were actually friendly. The Beatles even wrote the Stones' first hit song, I Wanna Be Your Man. But as both bands became global superstars, the competition got real. And John Lennon, famous for his brutal honesty and sharp wit, didn't hesitate to speak his mind. He often accused the Rolling Stones of copying everything the Beatles did. According to Lennon, the Rolling Stones always seemed to follow the Beatles' lead. When the Beatles released their groundbreaking album Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Stones came out shortly after with their Satanic Majesty's Request. And that's what started the whole mess. Lennon wasn't impressed. He famously said, Satanic Majesties is Pepper, basically claiming the Stones copied the Beatles' entire concept. In his famous 1970 interview with Jan Wenner, Lennon didn't stop there. He said, I would like to just list what we did and what the Stones did 2 months after on every album. Every thing we did, Mick does exactly the same. He imitates us. To Lennon, the Stones were just chasing the Beatles' shadow. He even took a personal jab at Mick, calling him a joke and accusing him of having a fake stage persona. Of course, Mick Jagger wasn't going to just sit there and take it. Over the years, he downplayed the feud but threw in a few punches of his own. He once said the Beatles were a four-headed monster and that it was probably a good thing they broke up. He also said that the Stones were unquestionably the best live band. The war of words between Lennon and Jagger went on for years, even after the Beatles split. It wasn't just about music, it was about legacy. Who would be remembered as the greatest band of their generation? At number 7, we have Herman's Hermits, a band Mick Jagger disliked so much that even being compared to them would make him furious. Back in the mid-1960s, Herman's Hermits were actually more popular than the Rolling Stones. And that did not sit well with Mick. In fact, the Stones even had to open for Herman's Hermits at one point. Jagger once said, I remember one time playing in Philadelphia, and Herman's Hermits were top of the bill, and we were second, and there was some argument about the dressing rooms. The Hermits were known for their clean-cut, teen-friendly look and a bunch of catchy, upbeat hits. They weren't as wild or edgy as the Stones, but for a while in the 1960s, they were selling more records than even the Beatles. To Mick, they were just another Beatles-style copycat group that came in with the British invasion. But what really made him mad were the constant comparisons. People would come up to him and ask, "Are you Herman's Hermits?" And he hated it. He responded by saying, "It would kill you." So you go, "F you. Herman's Hermits is shit." To Mick, all those constant comparisons and those moments just felt like a total slam against the Stones' hard work and their cool vibe. In his eyes, Herman's Hermits didn't have the raw rock and roll edge that defined the Stones. Yet somehow, for a brief time, they were the ones getting top billing. And that's why Mick Jagger had absolutely no hesitation in labeling Herman's Hermits as a band he truly couldn't stand. At number 6, we have Frankie Goes to Hollywood, the 1980s pop band that Mick Jagger absolutely slammed for their live performances. Frankie Goes to Hollywood produced some of the catchiest yet most controversial pop hits of the 80s, known for their wild music videos and massive concerts. Their provocative anthem, Relax, was everywhere, but none of that mattered to Mick once he saw them live. He went to one of their shows at the Ritz in New York back in the mid-80s, and he was seriously unimpressed. In fact, Jagger thought the concert was downright awful. During an interview, he said, "I think it's garbage. On stage, the worst act I've seen. I went to see them at the Ritz, and they were just terrible, and they know it. The guy on stage was in tears. I don't blame him. He sang so out of tune. And it's all pre-recorded. It's all a backing track. I think it's a joke." Mick actually felt a bit sorry for the singer, saying, "I don't blame him, because the vocals were so poor. To Mick, it was obvious that the group couldn't reproduce their slick studio sound in a live setting. He pointed out that it's all pre-recorded, it's all a backing track, meaning they were essentially lip-syncing or relying on taped music, something completely unforgivable for a rock act. This harsh critique shows just how seriously Mick Jagger takes live performance. As someone who built his entire career on electrifying, high-energy concerts, he had no patience for a band that couldn't deliver on stage. Frankie Goes to Hollywood might have dominated the charts, but Mick saw right through the hype after witnessing their lackluster show. To him, all the flash, marketing, and controversy meant nothing if a band couldn't truly perform live. In Mick's eyes, they didn't represent real rock and roll at all, just a flashy studio creation that fell apart on stage. And that's why Mick Jagger couldn't stand Frankie Goes to Hollywood after seeing them live. At number 5, we have Keith Richards. Mick Jagger's most intense and complicated feud was not with a rival musician, but with his lifelong musical partner Keith Richards, who stood beside him on stage. Their relationship is totally legendary in rock and roll history. Together, they're the songwriting team behind the Rolling Stones, known to fans as the Glimmer Twins. But behind the music, their friendship has been a wild roller coaster, a mix of deep brotherhood, fierce loyalty, and explosive clashes. During the 1970s, while Keith was battling heroin addiction, Mick took control of the band's direction. But when Keith got clean in the early 1980s, he expected to reclaim his leadership role. Things didn't go as planned. Here's how Keith explained it later. "When I stopped dope and I said, 'Hey Mick, thanks for holding the fort. Give me the load. I'll carry my load now.' It surprised me that instead of a sigh of relief, he didn't want to relinquish." That was the moment the deep rift between those two really started. By the mid-1980s, the growing tension had reached its breaking point. Mick Jagger decided to pursue a solo career, something Keith saw as the ultimate betrayal. Mick released She's the Boss in 1985 and Primitive Cool in 1987, and Keith felt he was ditching the band that made them famous. To Keith, the Rolling Stones should always come first. He even described that era as World War III, not just a disagreement, but an all-out war within the band. Richards believed Mick's ego was spiraling out of control and that he was forgetting where he came from. So in classic rock and roll style, Keith fought back the only way he knew, with his music. In 1988, he released a song called You Don't Move Me, a direct jab at Mick Jagger. And the lyrics? They were brutal. He had lines like, "Why do you think you got no friends? You drove them around the bend." And "What makes you greedy? Makes you so seedy?" It was Keith's way of publicly exposing their feud, transforming his solo album Talk Is Cheap into a direct statement against Jagger. But the feud didn't end there. In 2010, Keith Richards totally restarted the feud with his autobiography, Life. In the book, Richards went after Mick's solo stuff, calling it bland and uninspired. He mocked Mick's obsession with high society and even took personal shots, giving him cruel nicknames like Brenda and Tiny Todger, ridiculing his manhood. Those words were definitely hurtful. Mick was furious. He called the book tedious and childish and refused to move forward with the next Stones tour until Keith apologized. For a while there, it seriously looked like the world's biggest rock band was actually going to split up permanently. Eventually, the two made peace, as they always somehow do. Keith later admitted he apologized to Mick, saying, "Some parts of it and some of the publicity really offended Mick, and I regret that. I wouldn't retract a thing." Through it all, one man often helped keep the band together, the late, great Charlie Watts. Keith once said, "I rely incredibly on Charlie Watts. He's pragmatic, incredibly calm. If Mick and I have a problem with each other, it's like, where's Charlie?" And that's the story of rock's most legendary partnership and its most bitter feud. We included Keith because Jagger absolutely hated him at various points throughout their career. Number 4 on the list is the Stranglers, the British punk, new wave band that Jagger completely hated. Unlike some other rival groups where there was personal history, in this case, Mick's hatred was purely about the music. The Stranglers hit the scene in the late 1970s with the punk movement, landing popular songs such as Peaches and No More Heroes. They were known for their edgy, keyboard-infused punk sound. But to Mick, their sound was just terrible. He wasn't impressed by the new styles they were bringing to the table. In fact, Jagger didn't just dislike the Stranglers. He thought they were one of the worst bands ever. Jagger was totally brutal with his opinions about this group. He actually asked an interviewer, "Don't you think the Stranglers are the worst thing you've ever fucking heard?" Without waiting for an answer, he immediately answered himself, "I do. They're hideous, rubbishy, so bloody stupid. Nauseating they are." Those words make it crystal clear how much he disliked their music. Calling a band hideous and nauseating leaves, no doubt that Mick found their songs unbearable. Basically, Jagger called the Stranglers' music complete trash. The harsh feelings were most likely caused by the new musical direction and the punk movement. The Stranglers were part of this new wave getting all the buzz, and since Mick came from that classic rock background, he wasn't afraid to put them in their place. Even Keith Richards, his Rolling Stones bandmate, openly expressed his disdain for the punk scene. In an interview, he said, "What's the point of listening to that shit?" Mick at least gave some of the new acts a chance. But it was clear the Stranglers didn't meet his standard. Interestingly, the Stranglers were slightly older and more musically varied than some punk bands, but none of that mattered to Mick. To his ears, their music was just noise. He probably thought they were trying too hard to be edgy, and he wasn't having any of it. The funny thing is, the Stranglers were cool with the negativity. They later admitted they thrived on being disliked, and any booing or stupid review just made them more hard-headed. Bassist Jean-Jacques Brunel even said a gig wasn't good unless it didn't end in a riot. Even though they sold millions of albums and became famous for being outsiders, Jagger never came around. The fact that Mick was so harsh about the Stranglers highlights that he always spoke his mind when it came to his musical peers. Even though the Stranglers had their fans and got some hits in the UK, Mick had zero appreciation for their work. In Mick's eyes, they were just rubbishy pretenders in the rock scene. That's why Mick Jagger didn't hesitate to label the Stranglers as one of the bands he hated the most. It remains one of his most brutal reviews of any band. At number 3, we have The Clash, a legendary British punk rock band, and one that Mick Jagger had very mixed feelings about. In the late 70s, as punk was gaining momentum, Mick initially had positive remarks about The Clash. The Clash were known for blending punk with reggae and funk, which likely intrigued Mick initially. In an interview, Jagger offered high praise for The Clash, calling them his favorite band of that period and commending their dance sensibility as well as a rock sensibility. It sounds like he originally thought the band was fresh and pretty cool. However, Mick's opinion of The Clash changed as time went on. By the early 1980s, he felt the band wasn't so innovative anymore. As the punk movement matured, Mick began to see The Clash as something of a tired rerun. He said, "I don't feel connected with bands like The Clash. I can only see them as repeats of everything that happened before. I think it's a bit unfortunate. I think no one would disagree with me." Basically, Jagger was saying that The Clash had lost their originality and become dull in his opinion, simply rehashing old ideas instead of exploring new territory. Mick's shift in perspective is truly impressive. A band he once admired for their energy and genre mixing later ended up on his not impressed list. One reason could be that The Clash continued to play extensively, touring and performing night after night, and Mick thought they had gotten stale. He felt they were simply repeating what had been done before. To him, that made their music less interesting. Mick even implied that other musicians secretly agreed with him about The Clash losing their spark. Of course, fans of The Clash would probably disagree, since The Clash are one of the biggest punk bands, famous for their revolutionary spirit and mixing up genres. But from Mick Jagger's perspective, by the end of their run, The Clash just weren't exciting anymore. Many fans still celebrate The Clash's groundbreaking legacy, but Mick's later criticism of them remains one of his more surprising views. Mick has a high bar for what keeps rock music vibrant, and if a band starts repeating the past, he loses interest fast. At number 2, we have the New York Dolls, an early American band that mixed glam rock and proto-punk. The New York Dolls formed in New York City in the early 1970s and were known for their outrageous style as much as their music. But Mick wasn't impressed by the look or the sound. He thought the Dolls were all show and no real talent. To him, they weren't legit punk rock. Jagger didn't mince words when he was asked about the New York Dolls. He said, "Ugh, the New York Dolls, what a load of rubbish." That one frustrated sentence just shows how much Mick hated them. To him, their music was trash. He said that the punk scene in New York had the Ramones and the New York Dolls, but they didn't really play that kind of music. It was more of a glam look. In other words, Jagger saw the New York Dolls as posers dressing in punky clothes but not delivering a genuine punk sound. In fact, Mick admired the Ramones' authentic punk sound, but felt the Dolls were just dressing the part without delivering the music. He seemed almost personally offended that they were mentioned in the same breath as true punk innovators like the Ramones. It's worth noting that Mick Jagger didn't hate everything about the punk movement, unlike Keith Richards, who hated the whole thing and asked, "What's the point of listening to that shit?" Mick actually gave some punk bands a chance. He often visits the CBGB Club in New York to check out new acts. This means Jagger was open to fresh sounds in principle. Mick wasn't afraid to call out bands he wasn't impressed with. and the New York Dolls definitely fell into that category. Their chaotic rock and roll, combined with their excessive glam, just didn't click with him. Ironically, the New York Dolls went on to inspire countless future rockers, from punk legends like the Sex Pistols to the glam metal bands of the 1980s. But none of it seemed to matter to Mick. Mick's comments about the New York Dolls show how he felt about artists he viewed as imitators or lacking authenticity. He basically laughed off the Dolls as a bad joke, calling them a load of rubbish. That harsh dismissal cemented the New York Dolls as one of the bands Mick Jagger hated the most. Finally, at number 1, we have Steven Tyler from Aerosmith.
This is Kenny Rogers, and this is Norman Mailer. We're the Toxic Twins from Boston's own hard rock Aerosmith.
Mick Jagger had a real problem with this American rock band, and most of it came down to one thing. He thought their frontman, Steven Tyler, was trying to copy him. Back in the 1970s, Aerosmith was constantly compared to the Rolling Stones. Both bands had that bluesy, hard-edged rock sound, and both had charismatic, strutting lead singers who knew how to command a stage. Steven Tyler obviously drew inspiration from Jagger's iconic stage presence, the lips, the moves, and even the attitude. It didn't take long for the media to notice and dub Aerosmith the American Rolling Stones. A lot of people think that copying someone is the greatest compliment you can give them. But Mick Jagger? He just thought Steven Tyler was a copycat, and he wasn't happy about it. In 1977, at the peak of Aerosmith's fame, Jagger sarcastically called Tyler a little sweetheart, then joked about how to deal with an impersonator. He said, "He's almost too bloody sweet. What can you do with him? Punch him in the mouth." These words made his feelings crystal clear. To Jagger, Steven Tyler wasn't a rival. He was a wannabe, someone pretending to be Mick Jagger on stage. And it didn't stop there. When asked about Aerosmith's music, Mick didn't hold back. With a roll of his eyes, he said, "Oh God, Aerosmith, they're just rubbish. Absolute bullshit." It's rare for Mick Jagger to insult another band so harshly in public, but that's how deeply he felt about Aerosmith's supposed lack of originality. He didn't just dislike Tyler's Jagger-esque stage moves, he genuinely thought the band's songs were garbage. That public slam hit hard. Steven Tyler later admitted that constantly being compared to Jagger hurt during Aerosmith's early years. He said, "Still, the cheap imitation of the Rolling Stones criticism was constant, and it hurt for the first couple of years." Even Joe Perry, Aerosmith's guitarist, shared his thoughts on the topic. He pushed back against the comparison, saying, "You could tell that they weren't listening because we definitely weren't sounding like the Stones. Done our best to try to, though." Joe later added, with his trademark humor, "We steal from everybody. Amateurs copy, pros steal, and we're professionals." For Mick, though, none of that mattered. He felt Steven Tyler was a copycat riding on the Stones' coattails, a flashy echo of himself. Every time he saw Aerosmith perform, it was like watching a distorted reflection of his own act. And that was intolerable for someone as fiercely proud of his originality as Jagger. The interesting part is that even though there was drama, Steven Tyler's attitude toward Mick remained completely respectful and full of admiration. He said on multiple occasions, "To this day, to this minute, to this second, Mick Jagger is still my hero." Even when Jagger made fun of Tyler on Saturday Night Live in 2012 wearing a long wig, scarves, and doing Tyler's famous scream, Steven laughed it off and joked, "Oh, Mick got it so wrong, but he looked good with long hair. I've always wanted him to grow it back." That lighthearted exchange showed how their rivalry had mellowed into something more playful over the decades. And that's why Aerosmith and especially Steven Tyler topped Mick Jagger's list of the artists he just couldn't stand. So that's the list of the people Mick Jagger hated most. From punk icons to rock legends, he's never been afraid to speak his mind, and that's exactly what makes him such a fascinating figure in music history. If you enjoyed this breakdown of Jagger's most infamous feuds, there's a whole lot more rock drama waiting for you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss another story from rock's wildest legends.